describe it. I mean,
I was going to say one thing that we need to drop into the discussion here is that we work at an emotional level.
Well, what do you mean by that, Clif?
I mean that what we've done is we've when we started out, way back when, I was working for a big software company, and I'm a consultant for them, and they had some issues, and with a particular product that was very, very, very slow on an organizational level. And so I was looking into what they were doing and discovered that they were trying to save all this information about computers in giant organizations like Exxon that had 190,000 employees, and they wanted to keep it all in a database. And then I noticed, basically, well, wait a second, guys. You're storing the word 386, for instance, right? Or Pentium. You're storing that word bazillions of times.
Yeah.
Why not just store it once and have a tick mark for it? And basically, it got me thinking about language in a different way. And so we altered the way in which they were using SQL Server, which is a database management tool. And instead of having the complexity within the database, where at one point they had 200 tables, and the database was creating tables at the rate of 4 or 5 a day as people were making queries, just chock full of things. But basically, what we did was to look at language in an entirely different way and just store the language and then see how it changed. And that led me ultimately to starting to get, I went to Oxford and got a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, just a listing of all of the words, no descriptions, and started going through and assigning values to the words as to what I thought their emotional content might be. And then it got a little bit more complicated, and I finally ended up with a multidimensional array of emotional values that fall into 3 broad categories of immediacy values, shorter-term values, and long-term values. Because I noticed that people use language in kind of an odd way, that most of us might have a personal lexicon. That is to say that in the English language we might understand, say, 100,000 words and be familiar and comfortable with 50,000 of those words. But if you actually look at the number of words that individuals use on a weekly basis, routinely it falls into about the 10 to 11,000 range. And the question is, why? And then we also have to ask ourselves, why is it that language might change? Why do we invent new words? Well, it turns out that we invent those new words because we feel that our emotions are not our papa's emotions. So our generation's emotions are different and therefore need new words to describe them because the context in which those emotions are experienced are different.
How does this all equate, though, Clif, into these descriptors, or, as we can call them, predictors?
Well, here's what we do. We find that, for instance, people in garden discussion forum are discussing things, and basically it's the same things over and over and over again. But the language about those things changes over time.
Give me an example.
We might be discussing asters and how the asters grow, and then it starts creeping in there that people start using different adjectives and different nouns for the discussion about asters and how they grow. And then occasionally we might see that they plop in a reference to my how it's hot. And then we might see that the discussion starts branching off onto the sun and how the sun is extra hot.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And you aggregate this by the bazillions, and we're talking on the order of sometimes 70 million reads in a run, we call them.
Oh, well, are you assuming that all these people, in a combined way, might be predictors in total?
Correct. I'm saying that basically there's 2 or 3 ways to look at it, but here's a nice, simple shortcut. Say that there's a known percentage of psychics in a population. Okay, 1 out of a million are psychic, okay? Well, we got 300 million people in this country, so if it's 1 out of a million, we've got 300 psychics out there. But what if it's much higher than that, and what if there's degrees of it, and people don't know that they're psychic necessarily? Everybody's had some psychic intuition.
Sure.
And what if that psychic intuition must be expressed? Well, how is it to be expressed? Language. Not very many people out there miming their psychic intuition.
Well, how do you find it?
I got lucky. Because I noticed that one of the reasons that people hired me for software was I'm very good with a thing called design patterns. And that's kind of a weird concept to get across, but a design pattern for software may be discovered in the early part of a project, and basically it becomes the metaphor for how you're going to continue to solve the same sorts of problems that will evolve at various different levels throughout the rest of that project. Make sense?
Well, when we come back, let's get into a specific with you, George, and you, Clif, in terms of, let's say, a group of people worldwide are talking about an upcoming earthquake. And, of course, it hasn't occurred yet. Tell me how that would work. And then we'll get into the technology behind your software. Fascinating stuff. Later on tonight, we'll bring out some predictions. And then we'll see what happens in the future. Okay, we're back with George Ure and Clif. We're going to talk about this programming and then some examples here. George and Clif, let's talk technically. First of all, how does this work?
Well, basically what we do is we have a bunch of old servers sitting in a closet attached to a big pipe to the internet, and they go out and they read, they draw in conversations at forums and this kind of thing.
Okay.
And they don't really care who's saying what to whom. What we do is, for instance, this whole idea got started actually as an economic adventure, because it occurred to me that people were making decisions back in 1996. I discovered people were making decisions on the stock market, on emotion, not really on any kind of factual basis about stocks. And so I thought to myself, if I could find out what everybody was saying about a particular stock in all the different forums, and that was my forte, was processing vast quantities of data, then I could say to myself, well, the vast majority of people, for instance, are talking about Sun computer systems with this particular emotional kind of a deal. Only, of course, an individual can't sit there and read all of these things because there's too many of them. So it led me into the whole idea of dealing with the language, assigning emotional componentry to individual words and clumps of words in various different forms, and then analyzing it based on a numeric value. So basically what the servers do is they go to all these forums, hundreds of thousands of them, and they find a particular set of words that we're interested in. They don't count words thereafter. What they do is they read words, 2,048 words back from the word that they found and 2,048 words ahead. And then they do some sums based on these values that we've arbitrarily assigned to words. And that's where it gets a little bit into the gray area, because we're just regular humans making a stab and a guess at an internalized emotional component to an individual word.
Well, the government would love to have this in their pocket, wouldn't they?
Who says they don't?
Well, that's a good point, Cliff.
I mean, there are many people out there doing similar kinds of work. George, what was that How We Feel site, something like that?
Oh, yeah. There's I was just looking at it here during the break, in fact. You can get...
So key phrases. Let's say the government wants key phrases. Terrorists, let's say, or certain things like that.
Yeah, that's really a different approach than what we do. What we're looking for is long-term values. We're looking at what's going to be happening 6 months from now, or what
we don't really care about the words that are being used at this moment. What we care about is the words within that same conversation, which basically occurred 3 weeks ago. Why have the words changed, and what was the emotional value associated with that change? So in other words, 3 weeks ago, George Ure described on an internet forum how his wife stole his car, his ex-wife. And if we look at the various different permutations of this, today he's in another forum talking about it, only he's using different language, and he says, my ex-wife had my car repossessed, and there was an attorney involved. And we look at the emotional differences between those two conversations about basically the same subject. Only, of course, we're not really looking at it in terms of George Ure's conversation. We're looking at it in a general sense of all the different kinds of conversations, which basically are about a very limited set of subjects.
Okay,
so in other words, George, if somebody says, I had my car jacked, that's a right now stolen, short-term value thing. But repossession is a formal, attorney-involved, can drag out for years kind of thing. So one set of descriptors would point to something in the immediate future, like right now, and the other would be at some undefined point, but obviously more than next week. It's going to take some period of months for a repossession sometimes to work out. Make sense?
Yeah. All right, it does. Let's use an example, earthquakes. How would you be able to predict an earthquake?
Well, basically what we're not looking for is the word earthquake, because we actually monitor that, because there's a number of sites where people go in there, their pets are sensitive to earthquakes, or they get it ringing in the ears, or they get sleepy, or some other symptom, and so they discuss it on those sites. We're aware of those conversations. We monitor the total emotional content and the summation value of it on a per run day-to-day basis, but we don't really use those in the calculations other than to note that a particular spike there occurred at the same time that we were picking up our predictors elsewhere. And so let me see if I can put this in a real easy way to look at it. So basically what we're kind of getting is an emotional readout that might come from, say, the combined media that all of the people affected by the earthquake or who viewed it might be watching. And so certain tenseness appears in their conversation, and we have these anxiety indicators and so on, those kind of emotions pretty well mapped out, and a lot of them are used frequently with other words that we've noticed in the past preceded earthquakes.
I mean, what would you find if they don't use earthquakes?
Well, we would find,
what would you look for?
That we would do a summation for the Banda Aceh thing. We didn't actually predict it per se as a tsunami. What we got was an archetypical level of energy, which we translated as electrical, and force-driven water, which we translated as storms.
Okay.
We just thought it was going to be a big storm.
All right. Huge, probably.
Yeah,
correct.
And what happened to us there was when we were talking about electrical water aspects, what we weren't getting, because again, this is down at the archetype, was what the data was really saying was shocking rise of water. But we got electrical, and
that was a personal call on my part.
Yeah.
Because the descriptor set that we had for that particular subset was like 300 or 400 words, which included both electrical and shocking.
Okay, so you were right, basically. Now, Clif, when you go back to look, when you critique yourself, do you then say, I should have also said earthquake?
Next time, correct.
Okay.
And it's been suggested to us that maybe there would be some way to automate that process, and there really doesn't seem to be. I mean, the data analysis, going through literally gigabytes worth of text, all that is readily done. Reducing it to basically model space, which Clif uses IntelliCAD, and it throws a bunch of dots up, and where the dots kind of coalesce in this 3D visual space, you can click on dots and it'll give you a hex number Clif, and then you can look up. So you have this cloud of dots. You basically then do a reverse lookup and try to figure out what does this collection of dots mean. And so when you look at something like Banda Aceh ahead of time, you don't know that it's going to be an earthquake or subsidence of land or anything like that, but you can pick up things like land driven back to a previous age just based on the reverse. It's like a reverse directory for words that appear in model space, and it changes all the time. We can't do things like look at personalities, because personalities run fairly hot all the time. I mean, like Hollywood stars and things like that. What we're looking for really are things where aspect of earth shaken. You can get some number of reverse lookups that will go to the idea of